A kitchen window on 110th Street, summer of 1968. A woman stood peeling green bananas over a sheet of newspaper while salsa poured out of a transistor radio on the counter. She had come from Ponce 8 years earlier with 2 suitcases and a recipe for sofrito she never once wrote down. Every dish started with that sofrito, and every dish fed more people than it was supposed to. The dish at number 21 took an entire afternoon, and every woman in the family to assemble, and the ones who folded them wrong were sent to peel plantains instead. At number 11, a cook in Chicago turned a plantain into a sandwich that nobody on the island had ever seen. And number 9 is a pot of pork stomach that grandmothers swore could settle any argument at the table. Every one of them was built from memory, not measurement, in kitchens where the stove ran too hot and the grocery list changed on the walk home. Hit subscribe, because here are 25 Puerto Rican American recipes only your grandparents knew. Number 25, alcapurrias. Torpedo-shaped fritters made from a dough of grated green banana and yautía, stuffed with seasoned ground beef and deep-fried until the shell turned dark and crackled at the first bite. The mesa had to be grated by hand on a fine box grater, a job that left knuckles raw and arms sore, and the mixture was seasoned with annatto oil and a sofrito base before it was shaped. The filling was picadillo, cooked down with olives, capers, and tomato sauce until it was almost dry. A spoonful went into the center of a flattened oval of masa. The edges were pressed together, and the whole thing was lowered into hot oil. In Puerto Rican neighborhoods across the Bronx and Hartford, alcapurrias were sold from kitchen windows and roadside stands, wrapped in foil and eaten standing up. The outside crunch gave way to a starchy, dense shell, and then the meat inside released a burst of warm sofrito and olive brine. Number 24, tembleque. A coconut pudding made from coconut milk, sugar, cornstarch, and a pinch of salt, cooked on the stove until it thickened enough to coat the back of a spoon, then poured into a mold and chilled until it set firm and trembled when you tilted the plate. The name meant exactly that. It shook. The cornstarch had to be dissolved in cold coconut milk first, then stirred constantly over medium heat to keep it from clumping. Puerto Rican grandmothers dusted the top with ground cinnamon in a crosshatch pattern or a simple spiral, and the pudding was served cold at holiday tables and baptism parties. It was one of the few desserts that used no eggs and no butter, which meant it could be made on almost nothing when the pantry was thin. Number 23. Carne frita. Chunks of pork shoulder marinated overnight in garlic, oregano, salt, and sour orange juice, then fried in a deep pot of oil until the outside turned into a crust so hard you could hear it crack across the kitchen. The sour orange was the key. It broke down the fibers of the meat during the overnight soak so the inside stayed tender while the outside shattered. In apartments across the South Bronx, the smell of carne frita on a Saturday morning traveled through walls and down stairwells. Puerto Rican cooks bought the cheapest cuts at the carniceria and turned them into something that tasted like a celebration. The chunks were fried in batches, never crowded, because too many pieces at once dropped the oil temperature and made the crust soft instead of sharp. Carne frita was served with white rice, beans, and a pile of sweet fried plantains on the side. The leftover oil in the pot, rich with garlic and oregano, was saved and used again. Number 22. Pernil. A whole pork shoulder studded with garlic cloves, rubbed down with oregano, vinegar, salt, and black pepper, then roasted low and slow for hours until the fat rendered and the skin turned into a sheet of crackling that shattered like glass when you pressed a knife through it. The preparation started the night before. Slits were cut deep into the meat and stuffed with a paste of mashed garlic, olive oil, oregano, and vinegar, and the shoulder sat in the refrigerator overnight so the seasoning worked its way into every layer. Pernil was the centerpiece of every Puerto Rican Christmas table in New York. The roasting pan went into the oven before dawn, and by early afternoon the apartment smelled like roasted garlic and caramelized pork fat. The skin, called cuero, was the most fought-over piece. It was peeled off in sheets and broken into jagged shards that people grabbed with their fingers before the meat was even carved. Number 21. Pastels, parcels of seasoned masa made from grated green banana and yautía, filled with a stew of pork, olives, capers, and chickpeas, wrapped in banana leaves, tied with kitchen string, and boiled until the masa firmed and the filling melded into it. Making pastels was never a one-person job. Puerto Rican families turned it into an assembly line during the holidays. One person grated the green bananas, another ground the yautía. Someone else prepared the filling and cut the banana leaves. The leaves were wiped with oil, a scoop of masa was spread across the center, a spoonful of meat went on top, and the whole thing was folded into a tight rectangle and tied shut. Dozens were made in a single sitting. They were boiled in batches and eaten hot. The banana leaf peeled back to reveal a dense, savory block that tasted like the sum of a kitchen that had been working since morning. Number 20. Mofongo. Fried green plantains mashed in a wooden pylon with garlic, salt, pork cracklings, and a drizzle of olive oil until the mixture held together in a rough dome that was dense, garlicky, and rich with rendered pork fat. The plantain slices were fried first, just enough to soften and color them, then dropped into the mortar while still hot and pounded with a heavy wooden pestle. The cracklings, called chicharrón, broke apart under the mashing and folded into the plantain, giving each bite a salty crunch buried inside the starch. In Puerto Rican restaurants and kitchens across New York, mofongo was served in the pylon itself, turned upside down onto the plate like a sand castle, sometimes surrounded by a ring of chicken broth or topped with shrimp and garlic sauce. The sound of the pestle hitting the mortar carried through the apartment, and anyone who heard it knew exactly what was coming. Number 19. Asopao de pollo. A thick, soupy stew of chicken and rice that landed somewhere between a soup and a risotto, cooked in a caldero with sofrito, tomato sauce, sazon, olives, capers, roasted red peppers, and enough liquid to keep the rice loose and swimming in broth. The chicken was bone-in, skin-on, browned first in achiote oil until the fat rendered and the skin turned golden. Then the sofrito went in, followed by the tomato sauce, and the whole pot hissed and filled the kitchen with a smell that sank into the walls. The rice was added last, stirred into the broth without rinsing, so the starch released into the liquid and thickened everything around it. Asopao was not served on a plate. It came in a bowl, the broth orange from the sazon, the chicken falling off the bone, the rice swollen and soft but still holding its shape in the liquid. A handful of peas went on top, along with chopped cilantro and a strip of roasted pimiento draped across the surface. Puerto Rican families in New York made asopao when someone was sick, when the weather turned cold, or when there was nothing in the kitchen but a few pieces of chicken and a bag of rice. The pot stretched without complaint. More water, more rice, another bay leaf, and suddenly there was enough for the neighbor who knocked on the door at the wrong time. Grandmothers swore it cured fevers. Whether it did or not, the bowl was always empty before it cooled, and nobody ever turned down a second serving. Number 18. Habichuelas guisadas. Stewed pink beans cooked in a thick sauce of sofrito, tomato, sazon, cubed calabaza, and sometimes a few pieces of ham or salami for depth. The beans were soaked overnight and simmered until the skin softened and the liquid around them turned creamy from the starch. The calabaza melted into the broth and gave it a sweetness that balanced the salt of the sofrito. This was the other half of every plate. Rice on one side, beans on the other, the two running together in the middle where the spoon mixed them. Puerto Rican families in New York ate habichuelas guisadas several nights a week, and the pot sat on the stove all afternoon, the lid slightly tilted to let the steam out so the sauce reduced and thickened. A plate of rice and beans with nothing else on it was a complete meal, and nobody in those kitchens ever apologized for serving it. Number 17. Viandas con bacalao, a platter of boiled root vegetables served alongside a salad of shredded salt cod dressed in olive oil, vinegar, and sliced onions. The viandas were a mix of whatever starchy roots were available at the bodega that week: yuca, yautía, green banana, batata, malanga. Each one was peeled, cut into thick chunks, and boiled in salted water until a fork slid through without resistance. The bacalao had been soaked since the night before. The water changed twice to draw out the salt. Once it was soft enough, it was shredded by hand into long fibers, mixed with thin rings of white onion, doused with olive oil and a sharp splash of vinegar, and left to sit while the viandas cooked. The whole thing came together on one large plate. The root vegetables were arranged in a circle, still steaming, their starches cracking at the surface where the boiling water had roughened them. The bacalao salad sat in the center, cool and sharp against the warm, bland roots. Puerto Rican families ate viandas con bacalao on Fridays during Lent, and on any day when the heaviness of a meat stew felt like too much. The combination was older than anyone at the table. It came from a time on the island when salt cod was one of the few proteins that kept without refrigeration, and root vegetables grew in every backyard plot. In New York, the roots came from the bodega, and the bacalao came from a wooden box near the counter, stiff and salt-crusted, sold by the pound. The dish looked plain on the plate, nothing golden or crispy or sauced. But the first bite of warm yuca dipped into that cold, vinegar-sharp cod told you everything about why it survived the crossing. Number 16. Tostones, green plantain slices fried once, smashed flat with the bottom of a glass or a wooden tostanera, and fried a second time until both sides turned golden and the edges crisped into jagged ridges. The plantain had to be green and firm, sliced into thick coins on an angle so each piece had enough surface area to flatten without splitting. The first fry softened the starch. The smash spread it thin. The second fry turned the outside into a shell that crackled when you bit through it, while the inside stayed warm and dense. Tostones showed up beside nearly everything on a Puerto Rican plate, stacked on the edge next to the rice and beans, dipped into garlic sauce or eaten plain with a sprinkle of salt. They were never made ahead of time. They had to be fried, smashed, and fried again right before the plate hit the table because a cold tostin turned stiff and lost the crunch that made it worth the trouble. Number 15. Pegao. The crunchy layer of rice stuck to the bottom of the caldero, scraped up in golden brown sheets and eaten with your hands or piled on top of the softer rice above it. Pegao was not a recipe. It was a byproduct of cooking rice the Puerto Rican way, in a heavy pot with oil and sazon, covered tightly and left on low heat until the bottom layer toasted against the metal. The trick was knowing when to pull the pot off the flame. Too early, and the bottom was still soft. Too late, and it burned black and bitter. The perfect pegao was golden, salty, and crunched like a cracker. In Puerto Rican households, the pegao was claimed before the pot was even opened. Children hovered around the stove waiting for the sound of the spoon scraping metal, because whoever was closest when the lid came off had first pick of the biggest sheet. Number 14. Cazuela. A baked dessert made from mashed calabaza squash, sweet potato, and ripe plantain, mixed with coconut milk, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, vanilla, and a little flour to bind it all together, then poured into a baking pan and cooked until the top formed a golden crust. The texture was somewhere between a flan and a bread pudding, dense and sweet, with a warmth from the spices that hit the back of the throat. Puerto Rican grandmothers in New York made cazuela during the holidays, and the process was an entire afternoon. The calabaza had to be boiled and mashed. The sweet potato had to be roasted until it was soft enough to press through a sieve. The plantain had to be ripe to the point where the skin was completely black. Everything went into a large bowl and was mixed by hand, because a blender would have turned it into soup instead of batter. The coconut milk came from grating fresh coconut and squeezing the cream out through cheesecloth, a step that younger cooks eventually replaced with a can, but older cooks refused to skip. The baking took close to an hour. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted squash the entire time, and when the pan came out of the oven, the top had cracked in places where the sugar had caramelized. Cazuela was served at room temperature, cut into squares, and eaten with your hands. It was too dense for a fork and too sticky for a spoon. In the buildings along Lexington Avenue, a woman who showed up to a holiday gathering with a pan of cazuela under her arm was bringing something that could not be bought in any bakery in the neighborhood because nobody outside of a Puerto Rican kitchen knew what it was. Number 13. Pollo guisado. Chicken stew braised in a sauce of tomato, sofrito, olives, and potatoes. The chicken was cut into bone in pieces, skin on, and browned in a caldero with achiote oil until the skin turned golden and the fat rendered into the pot. Then the sofrito went in, sizzling hard, followed by tomato sauce, a bay leaf, cubed potatoes, and enough water to cover everything by an inch. It cooked on low heat until the chicken was falling off the bone and the potatoes had dissolved into the sauce, thickening it without any help. This was the dish Puerto Rican families made when company showed up without warning because it stretched without limits. Add water, add rice, throw in another potato, and suddenly there was enough for 2 more chairs at the table. The broth collected in the bottom of the plate and mixed with the rice, and that last spoonful of broth and rice together was the part people remembered most. Number 12. Pinchos, skewers of marinated pork or chicken, grilled over charcoal until the edges charred and the glaze on the outside turned sticky and dark. The marinade was a mix of garlic, achiote, oregano, vinegar, and a little sugar that caramelized over the flame. The meat was cut into cubes and threaded onto wooden sticks, sometimes alternating with chunks of bread that soaked up the juices as they cooked. On the island, pinchos were sold from roadside carts. In New York, they were made on small charcoal grills set up on fire escapes, in backyards behind apartment buildings, and at park gatherings in the summer. The smoke rose between buildings and drifted through open windows, and you could tell which family was grilling by the color of the smoke. The bread cubes at the end of the skewer, soaked through with pork fat and charred at the edges, were often the best part. Number 11. Jibarito, a sandwich made with flattened, fried green plantain instead of bread, filled with garlic steak, lettuce, tomato, cheese, and garlic mayonnaise. The jibarito was not born on the island. It was created in Chicago in 1996 at a small Puerto Rican restaurant in Humboldt Park, on the northwest side of the city. The cook was inspired by a sandwich he had read about, but he swapped the bread for plantain and pressed the whole thing flat on the grill. It spread through Puerto Rican communities in Chicago, then to Hartford, Philadelphia, and the Bronx within a few years. The plantain slices had to be fried twice, smashed flat, and fried again until they were sturdy enough to hold a pile of steak without bending. A jibarito was not a delicate sandwich. It was built to be eaten with both hands, and the garlic mayo dripped down your wrists by the second bite. Number 10. Empanadillas. Half-moon turnovers made from a thin flour dough, filled with seasoned ground beef, crab, or cheese, sealed by crimping the edges with a fork, and fried until the shell blistered and turned golden. The dough was rolled out thin enough to see through and cut into circles with the rim of a saucer. The filling went in by the spoonful, and the fold had to be tight enough to keep the oil from getting inside during frying. A leak in the seal meant a soggy pocket instead of a crisp shell. Puerto Rican families made empanadillas for parties, holidays, and Saturday afternoons when the kitchen turned into a small factory with trays of raw turnovers lined up on the counter, waiting for the oil. The crab version, made with picked land crab meat seasoned with sofrito and recao, was considered the finest, and it rarely lasted past the first round of plates. There is a pattern running through this list that cookbooks never capture. Every one of these dishes was shaped by a kitchen that did not have the right ingredients. The achiote came from one bodega 3 blocks east. The recao came from another one past the expressway. The plantains were sometimes green when you needed ripe and ripe when you needed green, and the butcher did not always have the cut you came for. Puerto Rican cooking in New York was an act of constant adjustment, built on memory and substitution, and the women who did it never called it improvisation. They called it dinner. Number 9. Cuajito. Pork stomach stew, slow cooked until the tripe turned soft and the sauce around it thickened into something rich and dark. The stomach lining had to be cleaned thoroughly, scrubbed with lime and salt, boiled once to remove the smell, then cut into small squares and braised for hours with sofrito, tomato sauce, potatoes, and chickpeas. Puerto Rican grandmothers in East Harlem bought cuajito from the same butchers who sold the cheapest offal, and the preparation was just as demanding as any other organ dish on the island. The smell during the first boil was strong enough to chase everyone out of the apartment and halfway down the hall. But the finished stew, served over white rice, had a depth of flavor that no other cut of pork could deliver. The texture of the stomach after hours of braising was tender and slightly chewy, like thick noodles with more resistance. Older cooks added a whole Scotch bonnet pepper to the pot without breaking it open, letting the heat radiate through the broth without overwhelming it. The chickpeas soaked up the sauce and turned soft, and the potatoes broke apart and thickened everything around them. Cuajito divided families. Some members refused to touch it. Others waited all week for the pot to appear on the stove. The grandmothers who made it considered the refusal a sign that someone had spent too long away from the kitchen, and they said so openly, usually at the table, in front of company. Number 8. Arroz con dulce. Sweet coconut rice pudding made from short-grain rice cooked in coconut milk with cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, fresh ginger, raisins, and sugar, stirred slowly until the rice absorbed the liquid and the mixture turned thick enough to set when it cooled. The coconut milk was the backbone, and older cooks made it fresh from grated coconuts squeezed through cloth. The spices were left whole in the pot, fished out before serving, and the raisins plumped in the warm milk until they were soft and sweet. Arroz con dulce was poured into a shallow dish, smoothed flat, and dusted with ground cinnamon before it set. It was served cold during the Christmas season, cut into squares or scooped from the dish with a spoon. In Puerto Rican apartments across New York, a tray of arroz con dulce traveled between neighbors and relatives through the holidays, and the dish it came in was always returned with a different dessert inside. Number 7. Tripleta. A sandwich loaded with 3 kinds of meat, usually roast pork, ham, and steak, piled onto a long roll with lettuce, tomato, ketchup, mayonnaise, and a layer of potato sticks for crunch. Tripletas came from roadside kioscos on the island, but in New York they were made at home when someone had leftover Pernal and deli ham in the refrigerator and wanted something fast. The potato sticks were the signature. They came from a can or a bag, thin and salty, layered inside the sandwich so every bite had a crunch that the soft bread could not provide on its own. A tripleta was not a delicate construction. It required 2 hands, a stack of napkins, and a willingness to let the ketchup drip down your chin without apology. Number 6. Coquito. A thick, cold coconut drink made from cream of coconut, condensed milk, evaporated milk, vanilla, cinnamon, and rum, blended until smooth and served chilled in small glasses during the Christmas season. The rum amount varied by household, and nobody agreed on how much was enough. Some families left it out entirely for the children. Others poured with a hand that got heavier as the evening went on. The drink was kept in recycled glass bottles in the refrigerator, and guests were handed a glass as soon as they walked through the door. In Puerto Rican homes across New York, coquito was made in large batches and bottled for gifting. A good bottle of coquito from a grandmother who had been making it for decades was a currency of its own during the holidays. You did not buy it in a store. You earned it by being close enough to the family to receive one. Number 5. Ensalada de pulpo. Octopus salad made from boiled octopus cut into small pieces and tossed with olive oil, vinegar, diced onion, sliced green olives, roasted red peppers, and cilantro. The octopus had to be boiled until it was tender enough to chew without a fight, which took patience and low heat. Some cooks dropped a wine cork into the boiling water, swearing it softened the tentacles faster. Whether that worked or not, the octopus that came out of the pot after an hour was purple and tender, and it firmed up as it cooled. Puerto Rican families served ensalada de pulpo cold, on a small plate alongside other appetizers at holiday gatherings. It was considered special, something between a salad and a ceviche, and it was usually the first tray to empty at the table. The olive oil and vinegar turned the octopus almost translucent, and the olives and peppers gave each bite enough brine and sweetness to keep reaching back for more. Number 4. Dulce de lechosa. Green papaya simmered in a syrup of sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and water until the firm flesh turned translucent and absorbed the spiced sweetness all the way through. The papaya was peeled, seeded, and cut into strips, then soaked in a lime water solution overnight to keep the pieces from falling apart during the long, slow cooking. The syrup reduced over hours until it became thick and amber-colored, and the papaya strips floated in it like pieces of stained glass. Puerto Rican families made dulce de lechosa during the Christmas season, cooking it in large pots and storing it in jars that were given to neighbors and brought to parties. It was served cold, sometimes with a slice of white cheese on the side that cut through the sweetness with salt. The patience required to make it properly was the whole point. These recipes did not arrive in New York as finished traditions. They arrived as memories, carried in the heads of women who had cooked them under completely different conditions, with different water, different altitude, different produce, different heat, and a different stove. Recreating them in a cold walk-up apartment on the 6th floor with unfamiliar ingredients and a gas burner that ran too hot on one side was not nostalgia. It was a kind of engineering that nobody wrote down because nobody thought it needed writing. The fact that the food tasted the same, or close enough to stop the ache, was proof that the knowledge lived somewhere deeper than a recipe card. Number 3. Pan de Mallorca. A soft, sweet bread roll dusted with powdered sugar that left white fingerprints on everything it touched. The dough was enriched with butter, eggs, and sugar, rolled into a spiral, and baked until the outside was barely golden and the inside stayed pillowy. In Puerto Rican bakeries across New York, Mallorcas sat in the display case alongside quesitos and pastelillos, and they were usually gone by 10 in the morning. You ate a Mallorca with coffee, sometimes sliced in half and filled with ham and cheese, and pressed flat on a griddle until the sugar on the outside caramelized and the cheese melted through. That ham and cheese version was breakfast, lunch, and a late-night meal, depending on who was holding it and what time the craving struck. Number 2. Huellas and salsa, land crab stewed in a thick tomato and sofrito sauce with olives, capers, and recao. On the island, catching huellas was a nighttime activity. Families drove to the coast after dark, shined flashlights into the brush, and grabbed the crabs by hand. In New York, that was not an option, so the crabs came frozen from the bodega or sometimes lived from a fish market in the Bronx. The sauce was the same one used for a dozen other dishes, but the crab gave it a sweetness that pork and chicken never could. Huellas and salsa was served over white rice, and you ate the crab with your hands, cracking the shells and sucking the sauce out of every joint. The table was covered in newspaper by the time it was over. Number 1. Mondongo. Tripe stew made from beef stomach cut into small squares and braised for hours with sofrito, tomato sauce, potatoes, yuca, corn on the cob, calabaza, and whatever other root vegetables the cook had on hand. The tripe was scrubbed, boiled, drained, and scrubbed again before it went anywhere near the stew pot, because the cleaning was the difference between a rich broth and one that nobody could sit near. Once the tripe was clean and the pot was loaded, it cooked low and slow until the stomach turned soft and the root vegetables melted into the broth, thickening it into something that clung to the spoon. Mondongo was a Sunday dish. It took all morning to prepare and filled the apartment with a heavy, savory warmth that settled into the furniture. Puerto Rican grandmothers who made mondongo did not ask if you wanted a bowl. They set it in front of you and expected it emptied. It was the meal that separated the kitchen from the dining room, the ones who knew where their food came from and the ones who did not. The stovetops are different now, and the bodegas have thinned out. But the women who carried these recipes from Ponce, from Mayagüez, from Arecibo, from Humacao, did not need a cookbook then, and the food they made does not need one now. If any of these dishes sat on your family's table, tell us which one still tastes the way you remember it. Hit subscribe, and thank you for watching.